Hey there, kiddos. My name is Serena, and I am the 11th grade girls counselor. I hope that each of you are doing well and are staying safe and healthy during this time. Today, we'll be continuing our Women of the Bible series and learning about Ruth and how her seemingly ordinary story is very much like yours and mine, and how even though God is hardly mentioned in this book, his fingerprints are all over Ruth's story. Before we get started, let me open us up in a word of prayer. Hey God, thanks for giving us the opportunity to dive into your word this morning and study the book of Ruth. I pray that you would open our hearts and our ears to hearing what you have to say and teach us through this story. And I just pray that we would be able to recognize the areas in our lives that you are present and at work, and that we would praise you and give you glory for that. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. The Book of Ruth is one of only two books of the Bible to be named after a woman. The other one is Esther. The book is only 4 chapters long, but even though it's short, this book has many lessons that I believe are still relevant to our lives today. We won't be reading through the entire book today, but I would suggest that you sit down and read through the entire thing. It's a short read and will only take you about 15 minutes. I'll be giving a quick summary of each chapter, but if you have enough time in your small group, go ahead and read through it now. The book begins by saying, "In the days when the judges ruled," which reminds us of the dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. During this time, there's an Israelite family living in Bethlehem trying to survive a famine. The father's name is Elimelech, and his wife's name is Naomi, and they have 2 sons named Mahlon and Chilion. They moved from Bethlehem to the land of Moab in search of food. Then the father Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons marry 2 Moabite women, whose names are Orpah and Ruth. Then 10 years later, the 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die too. Naomi hears that there's now food back home and tells her daughters-in-law that she's moving back. Naomi knows that the life of an unmarried and foreign widow in Israel will be very hard, so she urges the women to stay behind in Moab. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. Verse 14 says that Ruth clung to her. She shows her loyalty to Naomi by saying in verse 16, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." They return to Israel together, and Naomi changes her name to Mara, which means bitter. Chapter 2 starts off with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. It just so happens that it's the beginning of the barley harvest, so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. Boaz is called a man of noble character, and he shows generosity by making special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. By doing this, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command in the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi that he prays that God will bless her and that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day. Naomi finds out that Ruth has met Boaz, and Naomi is thrilled. She exclaims that Boaz is their family redeemer, which is a cultural practice in Israel. If a man in the family died and he left behind a wife and children, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry the widow, to take up the land, and protect the family line. So Naomi begins to hope that there might still be hope and a future for her family. In chapter 3, Naomi and Ruth make a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. Ruth is going to stop wearing the clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available for marriage. Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. As she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's very startled. Ruth makes her intentions very clear by asking Boaz if he would redeem her family and marry her. Boaz is thankfully not creeped out, but is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family. He calls Ruth a woman of noble character. Boaz is willing to accept Ruth as his wife, but there is actually another family member who is closer in relation to Naomi and Ruth's family, and that family member is actually more eligible than Boaz to redeem the family. Boaz willingly accepts Ruth's proposal if the near relative is unable or unwilling to exercise his duty as the family redeemer. Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day. In chapter 4, the closer family member is informed of the situation, but when he discovers that he's going to have to marry Ruth the Moabite, he declines. So Boaz redeems both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders, acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. Something interesting to note is the symmetry between the opening and closing of this book. The opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty from Ruth, and that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. In the two middle chapters, each one begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, followed by a timely meeting between Ruth and Boaz. And each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taking place. This story is beautifully designed, and like I mentioned earlier, God is hardly mentioned. The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story. And that's the story's brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of the story, working through and weaving together the circumstances and choices of all the characters. And none of this was just a coincidence. God's gracious hand led Naomi back to Bethlehem and led Ruth to go with her. God's gracious hand led Ruth to Boaz's fields that first day and turned Boaz's heart toward the hardworking widow from a foreign land. What appeared as coincidence was God's hand continually at work. Naomi's tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the story is about God's mission to restore her and her family, and he does it through Ruth's boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, and through Boaz, who's a farmer full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses Boaz's integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. Naomi goes from being bitter and empty to being blessed, redeemed, and restored. This story explores the way that God's purposes and will work with human decisions and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. This leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, whose lineage eventually led to Jesus. The seemingly mundane and ordinary events of this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so we should consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And so I have some discussion questions that I want you and your small group to go through. And so the first one is in Ruth 1:13, Naomi says that the Lord's hand is against her. Why do we readily think that God is against us when we experience hardship and suffering? In times of hardship, do you believe that God is sovereign and still working? And if you have time, share a hardship that you are experiencing with your small group. Second question, in Ruth 2:20, Naomi's demeanor changes. She is able to recognize God's kindness even though it's been present the whole time. What things prevent you from seeing God's kindness? Where is God's kindness at work in your own life? How do you need to be responding to it? Third question, Boaz showed undeserved favor, kindness, and unconditional love to a foreigner. Who is one person you can show undeserved favor, kindness, and unconditional love to this week? And last question, think about the seemingly mundane and ordinary events of your life. How might God be using and working through them? Those are all the questions, and I hope that you guys have a good discussion and just time of sharing.
Since the impact of the pandemic hit us last spring, we haven't had a baptism for a long time. Baptism is simply a public proclamation of a Christian's faith. We are currently planning on a baptism in mid to late April. Obviously, we will hold the baptism in a safe and socially distanced manner, and we'll hold 4 baptism classes over Zoom to help prepare and equip you for your baptism. If you're interested in getting baptized or have questions about baptism, please email me and I'd love to help you. The deadline to let me know is February 14th.